It's about rebellion. Because we have no time left. The climate is being, the ecosystem, degraded and destroyed at a rate that even climate scientists did not predict. The reconfiguration of the global economy into a form of terrifying neo-feudalism, the rise of a corporate oligarchic elite that cares nothing for human life. Karl Marx nailed it. Can't understand capitalism if you don't read Volume 1 of Capital. Unfettered, unregulated capitalism, which we now live under, is, as Marx said, a revolutionary force. There are no internal mechanisms of control, and now there are no external mechanisms of control, which means that they will exploit everything, human beings, the natural world, until exhaustion or collapse. And that is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. In theological terms, these corporate forces are forces of death. And it is incumbent upon us, and I speak as a father, to stand up and affirm life, no matter what the cost. Because resistance, as my students taught me, is not about what we can achieve, it is about who we are able to become. Resistance is an act of faith, a belief that the good draws to it the good, at least the good insofar as we can determine it, and then we have to let it go. But it is the belief that it goes somewhere. The Buddhists call it karma. We have to stop asking ourselves what is practical. It's too late for that. We have to stop trusting in mechanisms of power because they have betrayed us. Every act that we make now, every decision that we make now, must be to break the machine, including all of the political mechanisms that are used to mask venal corporate power, including the Democratic Party. I covered disintegrating societies for many years, all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the two Palestinian uprisings or intifadas. Viscerally, my anger at Bernie Sanders, intellectually it stems from his decision to run as a Democrat, but emotionally it stems from his refusal to stand up for the Palestinian people. Because we live in an age where we are going to stand with all of the oppressed or none of the oppressed. In the face of corporate tyranny, we cannot pick which oppressed group is convenient to support and which is not. Because it is the language of oppression, it is the experience of the oppressed that will teach us how to resist, and that will give us the honesty and the courage to fight back. It is, and I learned this overseas as a white male and an American, It is a curse to have privilege. This is the theme of King Lear. Because you are blind, privilege blinds you. You cannot see. You cannot understand. You become self-deluded the more privileged you become. And that is the brilliance of Lear, stripped of his power, thrown upon the heath, and then he can finally see. And I'm well aware, whether I'm in Gaza or whether I'm in that prison, that my own privilege, no matter how hard I try to understand, makes me unable to see. And that is why we must connect our resistance movements to those who are suffering most within our society. The decision by much of the liberal establishment to busy itself with the boutique activism of identity politics and multiculturalism and forget the primacy of justice. As poor black and brown people in this country were stripped of the ability to earn a living wage or even exist in dignity with drug laws where omnipotent police can kick down their doors in the middle of the night for nonviolent warrants, terrorizing everyone inside with long-barreled weapons and black uniforms and Kevlar vests. Empires die the same way, always. They hollow themselves out from the inside. The most dangerous institution in America is the military-industrial complex, which is bleeding us dry, $1 trillion a year. Which is terrorizing the wretched of the earth, as Frantz Fanon says. And as our society devolves, the harsh and brutal mechanisms of control on the outer reaches of empire migrate back into the heart of empire. So a night raid in Oakland for a nonviolent drug offense looks no different than a night raid in Fallujah. Militarized drones, wholesale surveillance, tanks on the city streets of Ferguson against unarmed young men and women. That is the disease of empire, the disease that is eating at the very core of our society. And as the country sinks under the weight of a corporate oligarchic class, as the assault on the middle class continues, the assault on the working class, of course, is over. As they run out of poor black and brown bodies to put in cages, because, as Marx understood, surplus labor is worth nothing to capitalists on streets, but it generates $40,000 or $50,000 a year when you put a person in a cage. And that's why they're there. It has nothing to do with crime. Because the real criminals run the country. From Wall Street to the Pentagon, in suits and uniforms. Because if you're poor in this country and you run out of a store with a package of Pampers and a six-pack, you get shot in the back or locked away for a couple years. But if you work for Goldman Sachs and you defraud poor people through subprime mortgages of hundreds of millions of dollars, you sit on trustee boards at Stanford University. I don't even know why poor people even try to commit crime. White people who look like me have nailed it. They're the finest criminals in the face of the earth. Not to mention the most efficient killers. Everything that we have done to the weak and the vulnerable, starting with African Americans, and as Faulkner knew, the original sin of this country was slavery, and it's still with us today. What we have done to Native Americans is still with us today. What we are doing to Iraqis, Afghanis, Pakistanis, Somalis is a continuation of the murderous pillaging and plundering that the white race has been on for 500 years. But the game is up. The game is up. And as Marx understood, in the final stages of capitalism, those forces pillage the very structures that make capitalism possible. And so we are seeing corporations feed off of the body politic, arms manufacturers. We spend about, we don't know, it's secret, $100 billion a year on intelligence, read surveillance, and 70% of that work is done by corporations like Bose, Allen, Hamilton, and others. The complete fusion of corporate and state power. The assault on public education. Anytime hedge fund managers become overly concerned about poor city schools, it's not because they want to teach people to read and write. It's because they know the U.S. government spends $600 billion on public education and they want it. And along with it, they want to break the back of the teachers' unions. And shove standardized testing down the throats of our children because they do not want them to be taught how to think. They want them to be taught what to think. The banks that lead the Fed, borrowing money at 0.8% interest, and then lending it back to us at about 16% interest if we're late on our credit cards. I don't know, that's not capitalism. What is it? Extortion. We have to stop sitting here and taking this stuff. We have to recognize that all of these systems are designed to crush us, and that it's time to rise up. It's time to resist. And we have to stop worrying about whether or not we can succeed. It's too late for that. Maybe we will not. I read climate change reports, many of you do. Even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, the effects of climate change stored in the oceans would be catastrophic. March, first month since we've recorded weather patterns, 400 parts per million carbon emissions every single day. There is no time left. And of course, the decision by the state to bombard the airwaves with effective propaganda is a form of disempowerment. A collective self-delusion, the insane positivism that reality is never an impediment to what we desire. You get it from Hollywood, from Oprah, from positive psychologists, from the Christian right. And it's all a lie. What will resistance look like? In the book, I spend time with those I admire: Mumia Abu-Jamal, Julian Assange, Jeremy Hammond, Lynn Stewart. All of those figures endowed with what the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr called sublime madness. And Niebuhr writes that in moments of extremity, a moment of radical evil, to take a line from Kant, it is only those endowed with sublime madness, with the capacity to stand up against overwhelming forces of oppression, that will open the door for the rest of us. Revolution. Revolution, despite the popular perception, is always nonviolent. Because, as the great theorists of revolution, Crane, Brinton, Davies, and others understood, no state is overthrown until the organs of internal security, or significant portions of them, defect. The Cossacks in Petrograd, sent in to quell the blood riots, they refuse. They fraternize with the crowd. They rush the Tsar back from the front, and he abdicates in a railway carriage before reaching Petrograd. 1979, the Shah flees Iran. His armed forces, equipped, trained by the US military, lay down their weapons and do not fight, much like the Iraqi army. Somoza, Carter turns back, the 3 ships filled with weapons, they do not fight. I was in East Germany